All right, so you know how we do these deep dives, and this time you've sent us something really interesting. It's an English language lesson, and it's all about describing people.
Yeah.
And so I thought, what better way to spend, 20 minutes or half an hour than just kind of like digging into this and seeing what we can learn about how we talk about people.
Yeah. A lot of people think about language learning as, memorizing long lists of vocabulary.
Right.
But what's really fascinating, I think, is how we use that vocabulary, right? So this is a great opportunity to kind of go beyond just the words themselves
Yeah.
and look at, some of the cultural assumptions and the nuances and how we use language to describe each other.
Yeah, and I'm excited about this one because we've got this great dialogue here. It's from, I think, an English learning podcast,
Right.
and it has all these like little bits of language where you can just kind of like feel like there's so much more going on underneath the surface.
Exactly.
So let's just dive right in.
Okay.
So we've got this woman, Irene, and she's talking about a guy she went on a date with named David. And right out of the gate, the first thing she says is, he's really good looking.
Okay.
So pretty straightforward, right? We kind of all know what that means. But like even there, I feel like there's a little bit of a linguistic choice happening,
Absolutely.
Like why good looking versus, I don't know, handsome or.
Right. And actually, the hosts of this lesson that we're looking at, they touch on this a little bit, right? They're talking about how handsome sounds a little bit old-fashioned to them,
Yeah.
and good-looking feels a little bit more natural.
Hmm.
So it is interesting to think about that, why one versus the other.
Yeah, I feel like you would describe, like a dashing hero from a Jane Austen novel as handsome.
Right.
But you'd be like, oh, yeah, the guy at the coffee shop was really good looking.
Exactly. Yeah. And, it makes you wonder if maybe that says something about the way we view compliments now, too, right? Like maybe things are just a little bit less formal than they used to be.
Less formal, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's reflected in our language.
That's interesting, yeah. So she says he's really good looking. And then she goes on to say he's quite tall, around 6'1".
Okay.
So let's unpack that a little bit. Quite tall. I mean, he's tall, but it's not like she's saying he's like incredibly super tall,
Yeah. She's not saying he's like towering over everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So what is that quite doing there?
So quite is a really interesting word because it acts as what linguists call a downtoner.
Okay.
So it kind of softens the intensity of what you're saying.
Right.
So he's tall, but he's not like, super duper tall,
Yeah.
right? It's just sort of like a subtle way of kind of, calibrating the description a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then 6'1", I was thinking about that. Like in the US and Canada, we still talk about height in feet and inches.
Right.
But if you're talking to someone from, I don't know, like Europe or Asia or most other parts of the world, they're going to be thinking in meters and centimeter.
Right, exactly. So 6'1" is roughly equivalent to, I think, 180 centimeters or so.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So it's just, another example of how even something as basic as, units of measurement
Yeah.
can be culturally specific.
Right. And the lesson actually gives some good advice here, which was that if you're talking to someone in the US or Canada, just use feet and inches.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be the most understandable, and you're not going to make them like do that mental math.
Exactly. It's a little detail, but it can actually help communication a lot.
It can, yeah. Okay, so next up, Irene says that David is in his early 30s,
Okay.
which is such a common way to give an approximate age.
It is.
But when we say early 30s or mid 30s or late 30s, like, are there generally accepted ranges there?
I mean, there aren't like hard and fast rules, but there are some loose conventions. So like if you say someone's in their early 30s,
Right.
you're probably thinking like 30, 31, 32, maybe stretching to 33.
Yeah.
Mid 30s, you're thinking like 34 to 36, somewhere in there.
Right.
And then late 30s would be like 37, 38, 39.
But it's interesting they pointed out in the lesson that you wouldn't really hear someone say like, oh, he's in his mid-teens or something like that.
Yeah, why do you think that is?
It's weird, right?
Yeah, it does sound kind of odd.
Yeah.
I guess maybe because with teenagers, each year feels so significant, right? You've
Yeah.
got, starting high school, getting your driver's license, turning 18.
Yeah.
So maybe it just doesn't feel right to kind of lump those years together in the same way.
Yeah, and I guess when you're younger, like a year or two makes a proportionally bigger difference
Right.
than when you're, in your 30s.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of like the context of life stage kind of comes into play there.
Yeah.
Okay, so Irene then goes on to say, the most beautiful dark brown eyes.
Okay.
Pretty straightforward, good positive attribute. But then her friend chimes in and says, he sounds hot.
Okay.
And that takes it to a whole different level, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And the original lesson actually makes a good point about this. They're saying that hot is really informal.
Right. Right.
So means, very attractive or even kind of sexy. But it's not something you would necessarily say to someone's face.
Yeah, you wouldn't walk into a meeting and be like, hey, everybody, hot presentation today.
Right, exactly.
It's much more something you would say, like, to a friend. Like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, you went on a date with him. He sounds hot.
Exactly.
But yeah, you got to be careful with that one.
Definitely.
So moving on from David's looks, Irene mentions that he's a junior investment banker at Fortune Bank.
Okay. Yeah.
Which brings up the idea of a career path.
Right.
So what exactly do we mean when we talk about someone's career path?
So in the lesson, they define it as like a planned progression of jobs and roles within a particular field.
Okay.
Over a long period of time, so like 10 or 20 years.
Okay.
And they talk about David having like a good career path as an investment banker.
Yeah.
So what do you think are some of the associations that people have with that kind of career path?
I think it's often seen as a path to, success and stability and
Right, yeah.
financial reward. Like certain fields are seen as having like these clear ladders to climb.
Right.
But it's interesting because I think the idea of a career path is kind of changing.
It is.
Like these days, it's not always so linear anymore.
Yeah, it's definitely not as straightforward as it used to be.
Okay, so then the lesson focused on 3 specific phrases they wanted to teach: heard, fill me in, and career path.
Okay.
So let's start with heard.
Okay.
Obviously it's the past tense of here, but they gave these examples like, I heard you're dating a new guy, or Julie told me she heard that you're pregnant, or even like, what, you got fired, I heard that you quit.
Right.
So what's going on there with heard?
Well, I think in all those cases, it's signaling that the information is not firsthand knowledge.
Right.
So it's like something you've picked up indirectly.
Right, like you're not saying, oh, I know for a fact you're pregnant.
Exactly. Yeah, you're kind of like putting a little bit of distance between yourself and the information.
Yeah, it's kind of like saying, I'm not sure if this is true, but this is what I heard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a linguist would talk about this in terms of evidentiality.
Mm-hmm.
So like how we indicate, where we got information from and how reliable it is.
Right.
So heard is kind of a way of saying like, got this information from somewhere else. I'm not totally sure if it's true, but I'm passing it along.
Okay, so that's heard. What about fill me in?
Fill me in is a little bit more straightforward, I think.
Yeah.
So they basically define it as like, tell me about it or give me the details.
Right.
And the examples they use are like being late for a meeting and you need to know what happened.
Right.
Or missing the start of a movie.
Right.
So basically it's a request to kind of be brought up to speed on something you've missed.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think in both those cases, it's not just like, tell me everything.
Right.
It's like, tell me the important stuff.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Like the key details.
Right.
So I can understand what's going on.
Okay. And then finally, we've got